CNT120, Chap4Lab. We're moving on to part 2 with ARP. Super quickly, we want to remember what ARP's function is. ARP is an IP version 4 protocol, and ARP is there when I know the IP address of the device I'm trying to communicate with, and I don't know its MAC. ARP will kick in and say, hey, can somebody help me find the MAC address of this device we're trying to reach? Remember, in my header, I need a destination MAC address and I need a destination IP address to get the data to that device. Well, I can get the IP through something like DNS. I request the name of that web page and the IP comes back. Once I have that, then ARP kicks in and says, hey, does anybody know the MAC address of this thing? And if it's on the same network, if these two devices are the same network, that ARP will most likely yield the MAC address of that computer, that server, that printer kind of thing. If it's on a different network, what ends up usually happening is the gateway device, like your router, hands the MAC address to you of them and says, hey, just use this MAC address and I will get you to where you need to go. Just a little side note there on what usually happens. So we're going to take a look at some ARP messages that most likely happened in the last part of the lab. So I still have this Wireshark open from the last part of the lab. I'm going to clear this filter out up here. Okay, so I should just be seeing all these packets I captured previously. I'm going to put an ARP filter up here. ARP. Come on, ARP. There we go. I'll apply that. Now, what I want to find is one of the ARP packets in here. And what I actually really want to find is one of these that's most likely coming from a computer broadcasting out. That's what we want to see. This is the process of like, hey, I'm trying to find this information. Who has blah, blah, blah? Who has this address? Tell blah, blah, blah. And most likely, I think the 119 is me. I think it's a 119 is my key. Actually, it looks like it's another computer, 26 and 119. Okay, so this is two other devices in the network doing this, but that's fine. So I'm gonna look at the source where we have a MAC address and the destination is a broadcast. That's what I want to look at. So let's look at in the ARP header, the MAC and IP address of the sender, and then the target MAC and IP address. So in my, I'll highlight that first ARP one up here. Just look for one that has that and broadcast as the destination. And let's open the ARP header down here. And we'll see this is Ethernet, protocol IP4 network, if you will. I'm going to scroll down here to the sender MAC address. The sender MAC address has it filled in. It's like, hey, I'm the one sending this, and here's the IP address of me that I'm sending. If I look at the target MAC address, you'll see all zeros. Oh, that's almost like a blank, like an empty space saying, hey, somebody help me fill this in. But here is the destination IP. So they got the destination IP through something like DNS. They resolved the name into an IP, and now they're like, hey, I know the IP, but I don't know the MAC. Can anybody help me out? And it basically sends this out with like all zeros in there, almost like an empty blank, hoping somebody will respond and fill in that MAC address for me. That's what I should be seeing there. That's what I should be seeing there. So that gets done in the network to try to find the IP and MAC mapping of devices. Well, what I can do now is I'm going to minimize that. I can now look at my computer, and I'm going to pull up my Windows command prompt. I'm looking at my Windows command prompt now. I can actually look at this MAC to IP address mapping on my computer if I do an ARP-A. And this will actually show for for my device the MAC to IP address mapping. And I think my computer is 10.107. I think mine was 10.107. Let me look up here a second. Yeah, there we are at 10.107. So it's like, okay, on this interface, 10.107, we have these IP to MAC address mapping. So it has learned a handful while this computer's been on this morning. This IP goes to this MAC, IP goes to this MAC, IP goes to this MAC, and so forth. That keeps them in there, so hopefully it does not have to ARP. Once it learns them, it holds on to them, it should not have to ARP for them. Now, this will go away. If I turn the computer off and turn it back on, it has to relearn these. But right now it has these, so if I have this MAC to IP address mapping, I don't have to ARP for them. I would not have to do that. We're going to capture that in a second, but before we do that, let's take a look at ARP on our Linux machine. So if I do just plain ARP over here, I can see this might be a smaller table because this is a virtual machine, but it has communicated a little bit on the network already, and there is its IP to MAC address mappings as well. All right, and again, since it maintains that, it does not have to broadcast out to find the MAC address of that IP once it has learned it, or hold on to that for a while. Well, let's gather those two results. So I'm going to just minimize my VM real quick. On my Windows side, I'm just going to capture this section that was the IP address of my Ethernet 3. Okay, in this case it was 10.107, and I'm getting that from here. So my Ethernet 3 was 10.107. There it is. So I'm just going to capture that part of the table. I'm not going to gather it all, but I will capture that part of my ARP table. So I will highlight that. I'll do a Control C. I'm going to open up my notepad file, and here I'm going to do a part 2. This is my ARP table, and I will paste that in, and that's my ARP table for my Windows machine, and I will save that file. Okay, I'm going to save that text file. I'm just going to minimize that. I'm going to do the same function on my Linux VM. So my Linux VM, let me pull this guy back up. I haven't started one yet, so I'm going to go here and I will do text editor. Oop, if I can type, there we go. I'll do text editor on here. Again, I'll put a name up here of CNT120, Chap4Lab, Mr. Brown. You'll put your name in, and I'll put in here, this is my part 2, my ARP table. And then I can add this to it. So I will come over here, I will highlight this ARP table. I can do a copy on this one, right-click copy. I can come over here and paste and just make sure I'm getting my ARP table. Yep, that looks right. I will save this file save as, and what I might want to do is I'll go to my documents here, student documents. Here's my Brown 120 that I created for, I think it was Chap4Lab. There we go, yep. And I will come up here and I will call this CNT120 Chap4Lab Linux, and I'll go .txt. I'm adding the .txt for me, and I will do a save. And then I'll just do a double check to make sure it's there. I'll go to my folder here. I'll go to Documents, and I'll look for Brown 120, and then there is my Chap4Lab. Yep, there it is. And just make sure you're saving. As you add stuff to it, make sure you are doing a file save. That way you don't forget to keep your results. And again, we're going to add to this as the lab goes on. So there's my ARP table on both Windows and Linux. We'll come back to the next part and look at DNS and UDP.